Hospitals have always made people uneasy. Something about the sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the coppery scent of blood, the endless beeping of machines, and the way shadows seem to grow long and thin beneath the pale, flickering lights. As an orderly working the night shift, you grow accustomed to it, the way the hospital breathes differently after dark, when most people are asleep and the night grows still. The sounds become sharper, the corners darker. You stop questioning the strangeness and just accept it. For me, I had been working the night shift at Southview General Hospital for nearly 3 years. There wasn't much I hadn't seen, and for the most part, nothing truly bothered me. Not the strange occurrences, the lights flickering for no reason, or the occasional alarm from a room that should have been empty. Even the way patients sometimes whispered about seeing shadows in their rooms late at night, it all rolled off me. I used to think I'd gotten used to all of it. But nothing unnerved me like room 207. Southview was one of those old, sprawling city hospitals. You know the type, endless hallways, wings added on over the years, rooms that seemed forgotten by time, and corners that smelled faintly of decay, no matter how much disinfectant was used. Some parts of the hospital were newer, bustling, filled with the latest technology and bright, sterile rooms. But then, there were the older sections, where the walls seemed to sag under the weight of age and the lighting wasn't as bright. The original structure had been built in the 1930s, a relic from an era when medicine was far more about confinement than care. Room 207 sat in one of those older sections. I had no reason to go to the old wing often. No one did, not anymore. It had once been a surgical wing, back when the hospital's resources had been more spread out, but with renovations and upgrades, most of it had been shut down or repurposed for storage. The newer wings had everything the hospital needed. The first time I saw room 207, it was a curiosity, like a remnant of a bygone era. The door was old, its pale yellow paint chipped and cracking, and a small brass number plate, 207, hung at an odd angle, as though someone had tried to pull it off. The light above the door always flickered, no matter how many times it was replaced. But what made it especially odd was that no one ever seemed to enter the room. I assumed it was used for storage, locked away with old equipment, but no one ever said as much. There were no signs of life in the room, no nurses, no patients, nothing. It was just an empty, forgotten space in the hospital. The door always remained closed and locked, and whenever I walked past it during my rounds, I hurried my steps, as if something invisible was pressing me to move faster. And then came that night, the night I first heard the crying. It was well past midnight, and the hospital was unusually quiet. On the night shift, you grow accustomed to a certain rhythm, the quiet hours between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., when most patients are either sleeping or too tired to make much noise. Occasionally, there'd be the buzz of an emergency, but that night was still, almost too still. I was finishing up my rounds, taking stock of the rooms in the surgical wing, making sure all the patients were settled. I had a few more hours before I could head back to the staff room for a break, so I was lingering in the hall, stretching out the time. That's when I heard it. Soft crying, muffled but unmistakable. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from any of the rooms I'd just passed. I turned toward the old wing, my pulse quickening. The crying was coming from room 207. For a moment, I stood frozen. My mind raced with logical explanations. Maybe a patient had wandered into the wrong room. It wasn't impossible. The elderly patients sometimes got confused, especially at night. I'd seen it before. Patients who would wander the halls in their hospital gowns, looking for rooms that no longer existed or trying to find the exit. I made my way down the hall toward room 207, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The flickering light above the door cast strange shadows on the floor, and as I approached, the crying grew louder. It was a soft, pitiful sound, like someone who had been crying for hours, their voice barely above a whisper. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Room 207 was always locked. Always. No one went in and no one came out. But the crying was real. I could hear it. I could almost feel it. I fumbled with my key ring, my fingers trembling slightly as I found the right key. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The crying stopped. The room was empty. There was no patient, no sign of anyone at all. The bed was neatly made, the sheets smooth and untouched, and the medical equipment in the corner looked outdated, covered in a fine layer of dust. It was a typical hospital room, just older, colder. A strange smell filled the air, something sterile like antiseptic, but there was something else underneath it, something foul, like the stench of rot trying to mask itself beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step inside, feeling the temperature drop sharply. The room was freezing, far colder than the rest of the hospital. I could see my breath in the air, small clouds of moisture hanging in the dim light. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone ever being here. Suddenly, a wave of nausea hit me. My stomach turned and I felt the urge to flee. I stepped back quickly, out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me and locking it once again. The crying hadn't been in my head. I had heard it. But no one was in the room. I hurried back to the staff room, my hands shaking as I tried to calm myself. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I'd heard crying in a room that was supposed to be empty? No one would believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? But that night, the crying stayed with me. I could still hear it in my mind, echoing through the silence of the hospital. The next day, I told myself it had been nothing, a mistake. Maybe I had misheard something, or maybe the sound had come from one of the other rooms, the old acoustics of the hospital bouncing the noise around the corridors. I tried to convince myself of that as I returned for my next shift, but part of me knew it wasn't true. I had heard the crying, and it had come from room 207. I started my rounds like any other night, checking in on patients, tidying up empty rooms, and making sure the equipment was in order. But I found myself avoiding the old wing. I didn't want to go near room 207, not again. As the hours passed, the hospital grew quieter. By midnight, the halls were empty once again, and the only sound was the distant hum of machinery. I was just finishing up in the surgical wing when I heard it. The crying. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same sound as the night before, soft, pitiful, but now there was something else in it, something deeper, more desperate. It was coming from room 207 again. I stood there, unsure of what to do. My logical mind told me to ignore it, to walk away and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something stronger, a pull, a compulsion, drew me toward the sound. I reached the door of room 207, the crying growing louder with each step. I fumbled with the key ring, my hands shaking. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open. This time, the room wasn't empty. There, lying in the bed, was an elderly man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he was hooked up to medical equipment that looked decades old. The heart monitor next to the bed beeped weakly, its screen flickering with static. The tubes connected to his body were yellowed and brittle, as though they hadn't been changed in years. I stood there, staring in disbelief. There shouldn't have been anyone in the room. No one had been assigned to room 207 for as long as I'd worked at the hospital. And yet, here he was. The man's eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath a shallow rasp that seemed to take an immense effort. His lips were cracked and dry, and his fingers twitched slightly on the bed sheets. I took a step closer, my voice barely a whisper. "Sir? Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. His eyes flicked toward me, but there was no recognition in them, no acknowledgement of my presence. He looked through me, as though I were a shadow passing by. I moved closer to the bed, my hand reaching for the call button on the wall. I needed to alert the nurses. Someone had made a mistake, left a patient unattended in a room that shouldn't have been used. But just as my fingers brushed the button, the man vanished. One moment, he was lying there, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with the beeping of the heart monitor. And the next, he was gone. The bed was empty, the heart monitor still flickering with static. I stumbled back, my mind racing. My pulse pounded in my ears as I looked around the room, but there was no sign of him. It was as though he had never been there at all. I fled the room, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. My legs felt weak as I made my way back to the staff room, my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. I knew what I had seen. The man had been real, at least I thought he had. But then why had he disappeared? Why had he been in room 207? A room that wasn't supposed to be in use. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, something beyond the natural. The next day, I couldn't get the image of the elderly man out of my mind. His pale skin, his hollow eyes, it haunted me. I couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. I needed to find answers. But where could I even start? I didn't want to tell anyone about what had happened. Not yet. If I went to the nurses or the doctors, they'd think I was sleep deprived, or worse, losing my mind. I needed to figure it out on my own first. I decided to start with the hospital's records. There had to be something about room 207, some explanation for why it was kept locked and why no patients were ever assigned to it. If I could just find out who the man was, maybe I could understand why he had appeared. Southview kept old records in the basement, in a dusty archive that hadn't been touched in years. It was a maze of filing cabinets, each drawer filled with patient files, maintenance reports, and hospital logs. I spent hours combing through the records, trying to piece together the history of the hospital's older wings. Most of the files were mundane, routine patient information, surgery records, incident reports, but there was almost nothing about room 207. It was as though the room didn't officially exist. No patients had been assigned there, no procedures performed. It was like room 207 had been erased from the hospital's history. But then I found something. It was an old maintenance report from the 1960s, back when the hospital was still expanding and the older wings were in regular use. The report mentioned a patient, an elderly man, who had been placed in room 207. The details were vague, but the report described how his condition had worsened over time and how the staff had neglected him. He had been left alone for days, ignored by the nurses, forgotten by the doctors. He had died in room 207, alone and unattended, and for some reason his death had never been officially recorded. The report ended there, but the weight of what I had read settled over me like a lead blanket. The man I had seen, the man lying in the bed, hooked up to outdated medical equipment, had to be the same person. He had been forgotten in life, and now, it seemed, he was trapped in death, reliving his final moments over and over. A part of me didn't want to believe it. Ghosts weren't real, spirits didn't linger in empty rooms, but I had seen him, I had heard the crying, and I had no other explanation for what was happening. That night, I dreaded going to work. The hospital felt different now, like the walls were closing in on me, like the air itself was heavier. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in room 207, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled towards something I didn't understand. The crying started earlier this time, before midnight. It was louder now, more insistent, as though the man was in pain, crying out for help. I didn't want to go back to room 207, but I knew I had to. I needed to know what was happening, needed to see if the man was still there. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The crying was so loud now that it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as I unlocked the door. The room was freezing. My breath formed clouds in the air as I stepped inside, the cold biting at my skin. The man was there again, lying in the bed, but this time he looked worse, much worse. His skin had taken on a grayish hue, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The heart monitor next to the bed beeped weakly, its rhythm irregular and faint, The machine seemed to struggle to keep up with his decaying body. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. "Sir?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I was speaking. I wasn't sure if he could even hear me. The man's eyes shifted toward me, and this time I saw something different in them. Hatred. Before I could react, the machines next to the bed started to malfunction. The beeping grew erratic, the lights flickering wildly. The man's chest heaved as though he were gasping for breath, and his face contorted in pain. His fingers twitched violently, and his body convulsed as if fighting against something unseen. I took a step back, reaching for the door, but the second I moved, the man vanished, just like before. But the room wasn't empty. The heart monitor kept beeping, the machine still clicked and whirred, as if they were monitoring a patient who wasn't there. I backed away from the bed, fear coursing through me. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the lights flickered once more. I ran to the door, yanking it open with shaking hands. As I fled the room, I swore I heard the man's voice, low and raspy, whispering my name. The next day, I was barely functioning. I hadn't slept at all, my mind consumed by what I had seen. The man in room 207 had looked at me with such hatred, such anger. But why? What had I done to him? I spent the morning digging through the hospital's archives again, desperate to find more information. There had to be something I was missing, some detail that would explain why the man had appeared to me. That's when I found it. It was buried deep in the hospital's old records, a scandal from decades ago. One of the doctors on staff in the 1960s had been involved in a series of patient neglect cases. He had ignored multiple patients, left them unattended for days at a time, resulting in their deaths. One of those patients had been the man in room 207, and the doctor who had neglected him, the doctor who had left him to die, was my grandfather. I sat there, staring at the file, my hands shaking. The connection was undeniable. The man in room 207 wasn't just any spirit. He had been left to die, abandoned by the hospital staff. And now his spirit was seeking revenge. Not on just anyone, but on me, because of my grandfather's actions. The realization hit me like a freight train. The man wasn't crying out for help, he was crying out for justice. That night, I knew I couldn't avoid room 207 any longer. The crying had started again, louder than ever, and the lights throughout the hospital flickered ominously. Objects in the hospital had begun moving on their own. Chairs turned to face me as I walked by. Doors slammed shut behind me, and I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I made my way to room 207 one final time, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I wasn't going to run. I had to face whatever was waiting for me inside. The door creaked open, and the room was as cold as a tomb. The man lay in the bed, his body deteriorating, his skin sagging and gray. The machines next to him were malfunctioning, the heart monitor beeping wildly, as though the man were on the verge of death. Again. He turned his head slowly towards me, and his eyes burned with hatred. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the words would matter. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." The man's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. The machines around the bed began to spark, and the lights overhead flickered violently. The man's mouth opened, but instead of words, a horrible, guttural sound came out, like the final breath of someone who had been holding onto life for far too long. I felt a weight settle over me, as though the room itself was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room went silent. The man was gone. The bed was empty. The crying had stopped. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay at Southview any longer. I knew that now. The hospital was more than just haunted. It was a place where the past refused to stay buried, where the sins of the past had come back to claim their due. As I drove away from the hospital, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the shadows. watching me.